Welcome to another episode of the Cleine Line. I'm Jamie Cleine, former Mayor of the Buller District and current West Coast Tasman candidate for New Zealand First in the 2026 general election. This week I want to talk about a report released by IAG, one of New Zealand's largest general insurers. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the mention of an insurance report, please stay with me, because hidden inside this report is a question every homeowner, every business, every ratepayer and taxpayer should be asking. Who should pay to reduce natural hazard risk in New Zealand? And perhaps more importantly, who benefits when that risk is reduced? Because I think there's a glaring omission in this conversation, one that nobody seems particularly keen to talk about. Now let's start with what I think is a compelling point that this report makes. We're doing things backwards. New Zealand has spent tens of billions of dollars dealing with natural hazards over recent decades. Floods, storms, earthquakes, landslips and coastal erosion. And the vast majority of that spending happens after disaster strikes. We clean up, we rebuild, we write out the checks, and then we wait for the next event. And repeat the cycle all over and over again. It's a bit like refusing to fix the leak on your roof because you're too busy replacing the wet carpet every time it rains. Eventually, somebody has to ask whether this makes any sense. Because if you know a problem is coming and you know it will cost a lot more later, why wouldn't you deal with it now? And the report is absolutely right about that. New Zealand needs to spend more money reducing natural hazard risk before disasters occur and not after. Now, the West Coast and Tasman know this reality really well, as do many other parts of New Zealand. Here on the West Coast, we don't need a consultant's report to tell us natural hazards are real. We've lived them. Westport floods, South Westland's Waiho Bridge failure, state highway closures, storm damage, floods, slips, communities cut off, businesses disrupted, and families displaced. We know what it costs when infrastructure fails. But it's not just the West Coast. Across the Tasman part of this electorate, communities have seen the same reality. The recent flooding around Motueka, Tapawera, and other parts of the Tasman district has been another reminder that natural hazard risk isn't some distant future problem. It's happening now, and we know who ends up paying. It's always taxpayers, ratepayers, and local communities. The question is whether that is still the right model, because the world has changed. The risks are growing, the costs are certainly growing, and insurance premiums are also growing exponentially. And councils are increasingly being asked to solve problems that are bigger than their balance sheets. Let's get back to that question nobody seems to be asking. As I read through the report, I kept coming back to one simple question. Where exactly do insurers see themselves in all of this? Now, to be fair, there is a strong argument from the insurance industry's perspective. Insurance companies are not charities. They are businesses managing risk. If a community becomes too exposed to repeated flooding, coastal erosion or other hazards, insurers have a responsibility to protect their customers, their shareholders, and the sustainability of the insurance pool. And that raises another important question. If we don't reduce risk, what happens? Do insurers simply keep absorbing larger and larger losses? Do premiums continue rising? Or eventually do some communities become so risky that insurance becomes harder to get or simply unaffordable for most people? And that is not a future we should accept, because insurance is not a luxury. It is part of the foundation of a functioning economy. Banks need insurance before they lend. Businesses need insurance before they invest. And families need insurance to protect their homes. So insurers actually have a major interest in communities being safer and more resilient. And the report talks about maintaining insurability. It talks about reducing future losses. And it talks about protecting communities, which are all really good things. But if risk reduction protects the very market insurers depend on, shouldn't they be part of the funding solution? Insurers aren't spectators. They are one of the biggest beneficiaries of successful risk reduction. If a flood wall protects a town, insurers benefit. If stronger infrastructure prevents damage, insurers benefit. If a community remains insurable, insurers benefit. And if claims go down, well, insurers also benefit. Now, that's not controversial. That's simply how insurance works. And I think the same applies to banks. If homes remain insurable, then banks benefit. If property values remain stable, banks benefit. If businesses remain viable, banks benefit. Yet whenever we talk about funding major risk reduction projects, the conversation almost always lands back on councils, ratepayers, and taxpayers. Now, why is that? Now, here's where the debate gets interesting. This isn't about attacking banks or insurers. They provide an absolutely essential service. They employ people, they invest in our economy. Profit itself is not the problem. But we do need to ask whether the incentives are right. The major banking sector operating in New Zealand generates billions of dollars in profit every year. A significant share of those earnings ultimately flow offshore to overseas shareholders. The insurance sector also generates substantial revenue from New Zealand households and businesses. Again, that's not a criticism, they're a business, and that is how business works. But these industries have a direct financial stake in communities remaining safe, productive, insurable, and economically viable. Their business models depend on it. So why is it considered perfectly reasonable for local ratepayers to fund flood protection, yet it's controversial to ask major beneficiaries to contribute as well? And that's the part I struggle with. Because otherwise we are asking those with the smallest financial capacity to carry the biggest long-term burden, and that doesn't seem sustainable. So that brings me to what I think is a better idea, where everyone who benefits contributes to funding the solution. If elected to Parliament, one policy I will advocate for is the creation of a national natural hazard risk reduction fund. Now, the concept is simple: a dedicated fund focused on reducing risk before disasters happen. Things like flood protection, better river management, coastal protection, improving and strengthening transport links, protection of lifeline infrastructure, projects that reduce future losses and really strengthen our communities and confidence. The fund would be supported through a modest levy on the insurance and banking sectors to help co-fund existing public investment. Not because they're being punished, that's the banks and insurance companies, not because they're villains, but because they are beneficiaries. If everybody benefits from risk reduction, then everybody who benefits should contribute. And that seems to me like common sense. And for regions like West Coast and Tasman, the benefits could be enormous. Many councils simply cannot carry these costs alone. The scale of investment required is often beyond what local rating bases can support. A national fund would help ensure communities aren't left behind simply because they don't have enough ratepayers to spread the costs across. Now, the economics on this are blindingly obvious, and I think international examples are probably particularly conservative when it comes to the benefits of investing before disaster strikes. But let's strip all the politics out of it. Imagine I came to your front door and offered you a choice. You can pay me $1 today to protect your house from flooding, or you can pay me $8 next year to clean up after a flood. Now, which option would you choose? You wouldn't need a Treasury report or a consultant. You wouldn't need to go to a select committee. You'd choose the first option every time. Yet somehow when governments discuss natural hazards, we continue doing the opposite. We delay, we defer, and we debate forever and ever. Then we spend vastly more money after the damage has already occurred. Now, from an economic perspective, that makes no sense. And from a community perspective, it certainly doesn't make any sense either. The cheapest disaster is always the one that never happens. There is another reason that this matters, and that is the insurance affordability debate. Every election cycle, someone complains about rising insurance costs, and fair enough, they are rising rapidly. But here's the reality. The insurance premiums don't rise in isolation. They rise to reflect increased risk. Higher risk equals higher premiums, lower risk equals lower premiums. So if we genuinely want insurance to become more affordable, the answer isn't simply demanding insurers simply charge less. The answer is reducing the underlying risk they are being asked to insure. And that's what a natural hazard risk reduction fund would do. It would invest in flood protection. It would invest in stronger infrastructure, better planning. And that's what risk reduction does. Reduces the claims, reduces the premiums, and over time, everybody wins. Homeowners, businesses, communities, and insurers. The IAG report correctly points out that New Zealand has become trapped in a vicious cycle of disaster and then recovery, disaster and recovery. Now, I agree, but if we're serious about breaking that cycle, it must be time to change the conversation. We need to stop pretending this is only a problem for ratepayers and taxpayers to solve. It's glaringly obvious to me that banks and insurers are significant beneficiaries of investment into risk reduction, and every major beneficiary should be sitting around the table alongside government and our councils and property owners, because all of them benefit when risk is reduced, and all of them lose when communities become uninsurable, unaffordable, and economically fragile. So the question isn't whether we can afford to invest more in natural hazard risk reduction. The question is whether we can afford not to. Because every year we delay, the bill keeps getting bigger. And eventually, somebody has to pay. Now, I'd rather spend $1 preventing a disaster than $8 cleaning one up. I don't think that's radical. I think that's common sense. That's it for this episode of The Cleine Line. A big conversation, but one of many that we shouldn't shy away from having in New Zealand. Until next time, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon.